Darkness. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and today we'll be talking to J.P. Harpignies, who wrote a fascinating new book called Delusions of Normality. And I don't know how many times out there you feel like you're normal or you're not normal. It's sort of an interesting thing we realize, especially if we spend any time going into therapy or even just doing some serious looking at ourselves, that it's often hard to say that we are normal. In fact, one of the things that therapists do is kind of go, hey, it's all a mess out there. And yet, we still hold on to this idea of normality, that somewhere out there are those balanced, perfect people. And in some ways, it can inspire us because it encourages us to integrate and deal with our mess and get up from the problematic backgrounds we all have and refine and reform. But on the other hand, we can drive ourselves crazy that way. And that's just on the psychological level. But what happens when this idea of normality goes out on a social, on a society-wide level? And how does that shape our ideas of human potential and of what's really happening in people's minds, people's bedrooms, in the halls of politics, the halls of power? So the idea of the normal actually has a lot more power than we might think, given the fact that most of us probably recognize that if it's a reality at all, it's a tough one to realize. So I'm curious about how my co-host Maja Daou feels about this. She is Expanding Minds esoteric librarian. And Maja, do you ever feel normal?
Never. No, for this week, Erik, I really liked the word delusion that he chose to use in the title, because if you look at the etymology of the word delusion, it literally comes from like ludicrous and illusion, and even like allude, like how you allude to something, and it really means to mock or to play or to pretend. And I think the title's so good because it means we're kidding ourselves or playing a joke on ourselves if we think we're normal. And we all kind of like want to trick, like it has this kind of trickster element into it too, if we're going to get hermetic and esoteric, that it's like a big trickster thing. The idea of being normal is like a big trickster illusion thing, and I really don't think it exists. And that's why I'm so excited about this book, because I have never felt normal. I always feel, kind of freakish, but I'm kind of comfortable with that. Like, I've come to grips with that. And I think for most people, like you said, psychologically, they get messed up because they can't, accept the fact that they're not what, people would call normal, if that is even a thing that exists. So
yeah, I can even notice with myself how I maintain the idea of the normal almost as a way to kind of balance out all the heavy and crazy stuff one has to deal with in life. So it's like when I get up in the morning and I have my cup of tea and I look at the news on my, computer, it feels like for a moment there I might be normal. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just kind of doing what everybody's doing. But of course, if I think about it for a second, I'm sitting in front of this computer and I'm going on to Twitter, and like, how normal is that? It's like even the idea of like what people just do is changing so rapidly in our society, like the social rituals around cell phones or PDAs, because there's not even really cell phones anymore. Everybody's on their iPhones, and the internet is everywhere, and it's like you're not even sure where would you find standards of normal behavior. And yet, even though I think that I'm sort of pretty aware about this stuff, or at least I think about it a lot, I still notice that even throughout my day I'll go, okay, this is just a normal experience here. You're just kind of in the, it's almost like a way of not facing the insanity of it all.
I know, and then you get into this thing of what's normal and what's natural, like you said, like how everyone's getting into all the technology and everything, and then you have to think, well, is this really something normal, and how far removed is that from nature and our instincts and our capacities as human animals,
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I think we're gonna hit up JP. Flag that question for JP, because I think that he'll be good on that one, because he's also he's written about ecology and has a lot of ideas about the natural and how human beings fit and don't fit into the natural order, because in a way that's one of the core definitions of human beings, is that there's an aspect of us that doesn't quite fit the natural order. And even if you want to be Darwinist about it and say that, well, of course we're all animals, just we just happen to be tool-making linguistic apes, that nonetheless it's pretty clear that there's a sort of fundamental imbalance in human development, or that
we're not even normal in the world of nature.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's bring on our host, J.P. Harpignies. I've known him for many, many years, and he's been quite an interesting person in my life. His wide-ranging interests, and he's written a number of fascinating books, again, on the connections between ecology and politics, on genetic engineering, and he's edited a book on visionary experience and visionary plants. And his new book is Delusions of Normality, Sanity, Drugs, Sex, Money, and Beliefs in America. Quite a subtitle. JP, thanks for coming on Expanding Mind.
Hey, great to be here.
Excellent. So I know that this project has been a long time coming. I remember having conversations with you many years ago about doing research on this thing. What was it about this idea of the normal that captivated you?
Well, I think it's been in the back of my mind for many, many years. I think ever since adolescence, I began to notice, as many adolescents who are somewhat observant notice, that what I was told at home and in school did not jibe too well with what I saw in the streets and in people's behavior. And also, I think a lifelong sort of obsession. I was brought up in a household in New York where, of course, the New York Times came every day, and everybody read it religiously, and of course I still read it. It's an invaluable source of news. But I began to realize that there were so many assumptions between the lines, especially as I grew up in the counterculture in the 60s, and so many of the quote-unquote bourgeois attitudes, to use an old-fashioned term, that existed in the mainstream network, Newsweek, Time, New York Times, NPR, PBS view of the world. As much as I'm not unsympathetic to that perspective, that there were many unspoken assumptions that I questioned, that I challenged. So I always wanted to really explore in depth at some point what those assumptions were and why they were faulty in a few domains, in a few key domains of life.
And they are key domains: sanity, drugs, sex, money. It's pretty rich. One of the great things about your book, which is not very long and very readable, is that you've done a huge amount of sociological legwork. It seems like in every domain you hunted down the hard statistics that you could find, and in the places where you couldn't find the hard statistics, you talked about the lack of the statistics, the fact that you'd think that we would know, we would have some rough measure on human behavior in some of these domains, and that you found sometimes that there wasn't even there. Talk a little bit about the research that you went through to determine this question about what normal is.
Yeah, well, I picked those 5 domains because they're really visceral and get people where they live, so that interested me. And I did. I really wanted to just quantify. Well, okay, let's talk about normality and see how many people, for instance, if you're taking sexual behavior, how many people cheat on their spouses, how many people visit prostitutes, how many people have so-called kinky behaviors. And I found, to my shock, that even though I realized that those are difficult places to get information because people are reticent to talk about a lot of these things, that the data was really contested and that there really was not a lot of reliable hard data in many of these areas. And that was interesting because I thought, Kinsey had broken through 60 years ago, and surely there'd be reams of data. But then I realized that there's actually, especially during conservative administrations, there's a lot of pressure not to fund certain types of big studies on sexuality. So I was kind of surprised to find that in some key domains I could not get a lot of hard data. That said, you can still snoop around and find convincing anecdotal evidence, and I try not to overstate my case. If I can't prove something, I admit I can't prove it, and I speculate. But still, one can come up with a lot of, certainly to paint a picture of many of these areas. So sex was the hardest to find information.
To me, because if you think about the data collection and the research, like my biggest problem in my science studies was always how statistics are used. And statistics literally leave out most of the data that is part of reality, these exceptions to the rule, because they don't fit into the mean and the parameters that are set in there. So even for you, when you're looking at this data to try and find out about what's normal, you have to understand that they're leaving out a lot of the abhorrences, or the abnormal behavior gets actually ejected from the
Right, right. No, in fact, I try to look at different sources to see what their biases are. So I don't just cite one study that agrees with what I want. I try to look at, what all the different sources say. Why are there discrepancies between this source and that source? So It's interesting in and of itself. It's sort of a sub-theme of the book of how do you find reliable data, and what do statistics
it must have been
mean?
very difficult.
Yeah, it's very difficult. That's right.
It was really refreshing, too, and also kind of challenging. That's one of the things I really liked about this, is it made me realize how often when we read in books or nonfiction books or journalistic articles, particularly articles about trends and about large-scale social behavior and these kinds of things, that most of the time people are essentially selling you their point of view, their perspective. And while they'll admit that there's some ambiguity here and there, it tends to be that people feel this need, writers feel this need for whatever reason, to really concretize and give like a solid sense of what's really going on, or that we have an idea of what's going on. This is, classic with science, where it kind of prevents, even though we know that it's sort of provisional, it often presents itself as being really solid. And we get used to that. I get used to that. I get used to that feeling of some kind of, well, maybe I don't know, but that guy knows.
Yeah.
And one of the great things about your book is that it's clear you've done a huge amount of research and you've done a huge amount of work thinking about it, and yet you're very open about the way that you don't know and they don't know, and in fact none of us really know, and then it's like, our sense of reality as being this sort of solid, understandable thing begins to kind of liquefy a little bit, which is part of the point, is that instead of accepting that quality, we have this concept of the normal or the norm that we almost rely on and is used politically to kind of organize our sense of how reality works. And you bring us to this other point where it becomes a lot more unclear.
That said, I do want to say that it's still an ideal to try, and that academics at their best really do try to be objective. One can't be completely objective, but it is worth making the effort as an ideal, because to just be a sort of a nihilist and say, well, we can never know anything, that I would resist. So I think it's worth making the effort and then to admit what one doesn't know. And I think the point you make about it's very hard to find unbiased information, I think that's particularly true because money has permeated so much of academia, in the last few decades, that it's almost impossible, for instance, to find, genetic scientists who are not also involved in some private deal with a company. So a lot of the studies, for instance, in medicine are extremely tainted, and I get into that in my chapter on mental health and drug use and prescription drug use and overprescription of pharmaceuticals. So anyway, it is hard, but one has to wrestle with it, and I think one can't throw up one's hands and say, oh, there's no way to get good data, so we shouldn't try. That I would resist,
Absolutely. But, well, let's take that example, just because that's such a ripe one, especially from our perspective here on the show, being interested in the culture of consciousness and how people organize their spiritual and psychological world. Is this, as you start off the book talking about sanity and then talking about drugs, and it's really kind of eye-opening when we look at the incidences of whatever you want to call it, mental challenges as they're distributed through the landscape. What did you find that was surprising to you when you started to look at the data?
Well, the data actually isn't that bad if you really rummage around, and I was kind of shocked. But basically, the big finding is that there's pretty convincing data that about 50% of people in our society will at some point suffer from a pretty severe episode of some kind of mental, issue, and so I asked the question, well, if that's the case, it's as normal at some point to have a pretty serious mental issue as it's not. So what does that mean about being normal? Is being normal being functional so that society's happy because you go to work and you produce? And then even if you scratch the surface and you begin to go a little deeper, what does that mean? Okay, 50% of people have a mental issue. That means at some point they've felt bad enough to go see someone But then there are all these people who never go, who self-medicate with alcohol or, illegal drugs, or who don't think there's anything wrong with them. They're often the ones who are the most dangerous. So, when you really scratch the surface, the idea that basically, the bulk of us are pretty sane and functional, and then there are some outliers, different groups of people who have problems and need to see therapists, that really breaks down. You begin to realize that the level of mental suffering and anguish and of various, mental illnesses of various types is much more prevalent than you would think. And also that there are contested areas where it's even hard to define. No one has ever defined what mental health is, which is pretty interesting. So we don't even have a baseline to really define what health would be. And that's interesting in and of itself, I think.
And then that the ideas of what's going wrong with people develop themselves based on changes in pharmacology and in new medicines and shifting ideas in society. So it's really a moving target. What the norm is.
Right, and new disease categories are created and then fought over and renamed, and and you get it even in things like in the DSM, the statistical manual that all therapists, read like a Bible that comes out periodically every decade or so. If getting a condition in there makes a huge difference, because then suddenly you can, it comes, basically it's paid for. So if you have a disease category that's not listed, then your coverage won't be paid for. So it's a big, big area of contestation. And you get things like bipolar, condition and these sort of vague conditions. Things like restless leg syndrome on the purely physical level. You get things like that in the psychological world, and they're really fought over. They're really, you get the psychotherapeutic community is completely at odds with the psychopharmacological community. So this is contested terrain, and it's very, and the idea that now massive amounts of pharmacological drugs are given to children as young as 3 or 4. Who are being diagnosed with strange conditions, bipolar conditions, and this was unheard of even 10 years ago. And then the guy who was the sort of the apostle of this guy Biederman at Harvard, was exposed for having been receiving large amounts of money from the pharmaceutical companies that he wasn't revealing to Harvard when he wrote these pieces. And we're seeing more and more that a lot of the so-called drug studies are basically being funded, under the table, or even written by people who work for the drug companies.
Yeah, it's remarkable when you think about when you look into SSRIs, and I've talked. A friend of mine works in pharmacological studies, and when you look at the statistics that allow, even the statistics they initially used to justify SSRIs like Prozac as viable. They work at a very minuscule percentage higher than placebos, almost like the minimum better you need to achieve in order to be able to pass as a legitimate drug. So their actual efficacy, even in the studies that got them approved as drugs, is very modest.
Right.
Well, and another interesting thing that happens is once you get that diagnosis, like you said, and it's a accepted condition, that brings it to another level of normalcy, to think that if a kid can be diagnosed with that, then that's normal. They just need to take the drugs, and then they'll get back to normal. Whereas if you have a kid and you don't know what's wrong, then they aren't normal. But if you can say, oh, they're just, bipolar or something, then people can, process it in their brains better, and then it has, a set deal of solutions that are normal to be carried out.
Right, and that's right, and that's true for all of us, too. If I'm really feeling weird and then a doctor says, oh, it's this, I do feel better, because I know it's something that they've heard of and not some weird thing from outer space that's going to eat me from the inside, you know what I mean? So there's that's right. One thing I would say, though, is I want to get back to an earlier point that the two of you were discussing. I think it's important to realize that no society or individual can live without some assumptions of normality, that we have to have some. And all of us, there are attitudes that we all have that we don't examine, that we probably can't examine. In the way, there wasn't a single ancient Greek philosopher, as brilliant as many of them were, who ever questioned slavery, because their entire society depended so completely on slave labor that it was unthinkable to question the institution. So there are probably things like that we are all living with now, because our ideology, our belief systems are a bit like the ocean, and we're fish, we're in it. And we can't always see a lot of it. In fact, some of it is going to be invisible to us no matter what we do. So I think we have to accept that there are certain degrees of illusion and delusion that we have to live with, that it's inevitable in any organized society or even for any organized psyche. But the question is, as self-observant creatures, as human beings are, we can try at least to get some distance and examine some of it. It's pretty tricky in our society because norms are a moving target. Our society, as you were pointing out, Erik, is very changeable. Things are, technologies changing rapidly. And we can then develop this idea, there are no norms, everything's changing so fast. But that's what I wanted to challenge, that even in a rapidly moving society where norms are a moving target, at any given point there still are a lot of norms and assumptions that we don't question.
It seems like there's two sides of it, too. One, there are the norms that we don't question, that we still just assume that everybody has sort of running in the background. And then there's their idea that we still need to create norms, that we need to, hold out for the possibility of norms, because there might be a real danger if the concept of total relativism of norms spreads too much, where everybody's like, we're all just making it up, blah, blah, blah. There's a real fear, which you find more in conservatives to some degree, but it's an understandable fear, that the very awareness of the constructed nature, the largely constructed nature of our norms, will itself begin to undermine social cohesion.
Well, then you get into metaphysical territory where you get like Buddhist, and that the whole world is illusion, right? And then you can take it up to that level where it's like even our normalcy is just an illusion we create to deal with the fact that reality is an illusion.
Right, but I would say there are necessary illusions, although they vary. But one thing I'd like to say is that I think that one way that we have to look at this, which is tricky, is that every human being, if you take the 5 categories that I took, the sanity, drugs, sex, money, etc., and let's say you interviewed 100 people randomly across the population, and you got them to answer honestly, which would be extremely difficult and probably impossible. But what you might find is that category by category, maybe a plurality or a majority would be quote-unquote normal by contemporary mainstream standards. But none of them, or very few of those people, would be quote-unquote normal across all 5 categories. So person A might be, sexually fairly conventional, not on any psychopharmacological drugs, fairly functional, but she happens to love smoking reefer or doing acid, so that would place her in the quote-unquote, abnormal in the drug category. Or so-and-so might be completely functional, fairly sexual conventional, and Episcopalian, but believe that UFOs in Area 51 are secretly controlling the government. You know what I mean? So all of us, if you look across the board, very few individuals, I would say, are normal across the board. They're going to be off the charts of conventional normality in one or other categories. But because in each individual category the majority of people are quote-unquote normal, that's why the illusion of normality persists. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I just want to say this is Erik Davis, and we're listening to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I want to let you know you can email in your questions for JP at mind@techgnosis.com. That's TECHGNOSIS. Also my website. And soon we'll be taking calls, too, and the number here is 888-873-4643. JP, you often hear people talk about, about how wacky Americans are. It's like, Americans, whatever, 70% believe the rapture's coming and 45% believe in UFOs. And often one sort of sees that kind of thrown out as in part of a larger discussion or a discussion about religion in particular. But you kind of went a little bit farther into this question of just how wacky we are. And I'm wondering, how much of it does it seem to be specifically American?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I think people can be pretty wacky everywhere. Rumors can spread like wildfire that, there were incidents in Guatemala a few years ago where the rumors spread that Westerners were, kidnapping people for kidneys and babies. Things like that do happen on occasion, but usually, and then these rumors will spread like wildfire and people will riot, and or you get strange, religious movements in northern Nigeria, and we're seeing, violence now. So people are, and you get very strange, if you've ever seen the Eurovision Song Contest, one of the most bizarre cultural phenomenon I've ever seen with, heavy metal, death metal, Norwegian satanic bands winning the Eurovision Song Contest one year and Israeli transvestite chanteuses the next year. So they're pretty bizarre cultural phenomena everywhere. But I would say that among the industrialized countries, there's something about the cultural landscape of America that produces particularly wacky political ideas. I definitely find that we do take the cake in that regard. And I think that we've been seeing it, in the last even few weeks with this birther movement of the people who are absolutely convinced that Barack Obama was born in Indonesia, or these kind of ideas, these sort of conspiratorial ideas are particularly fertile ground in America for a variety of historical reasons.
Yeah, what did Richard Hoff start to call it? It was like the paranoid strain in American politics.
Right.
And that's certainly not hurt by our contemporary information environment. That was one thing that I thought about reading this, is that it really is true that in some ways you were motivated partly by your experience of being a daily New York Times reader for decades, where there's just this implied both the implied perspective of where it's coming from and who's consuming it, that it's this sort of fiction of this normal, stable, rational, secular reader and in many ways writer that sort of sustains this New York Times reality. And it's kind of like the New York Times has functioned in the past as this sort of foundation stone of what's actually going on. And nowadays with the internet and the explosion of different information channels and perspectives and all the sort of different ways that people are getting their information, that whole sort of world is mutating, exploding, imploding, whatever the metaphor you want to use. And I'm wondering whether you feel like our changing information environment is actually going to change the way that this idea of normality functions in our society, or what constitutes it.
Well, I think that technology, definitely the Internet and electronic technologies in general, communication technologies, are creating a situation in which it's much harder to have a commons in which people share, a large group of people share the same values. Because what happens is with the web, everyone can tunnel into his or her obsessions. And so you get this sort of plethora of more and more subcultures that people can go deeper and deeper into, and they sort of can disappear from the larger commons. It's almost they're going down all these rabbit holes. And so that's one factor, but I've got to say that in the history of technology, it's always a dynamic, a two-edged sword, in that on the one hand, a lot of these technologies create more and more power for individuals. Like the telephone suddenly gives someone the power to call China, whereas previously, a century before, only an emperor or a king could have sent a messenger to China, and it would have taken months. But at the same time, these technologies create very powerful bureaucracies that get more and more centralized power. So the telephone leads to, Verizon and AT&T and being able to tap all our phone calls. And the same is happening with the Internet. If you look what's happening in China and other repressive regimes they have thousands of people online trolling constantly. And I think the idea that the web will empower individuals is true, but it's also true that it will enhance massive systems of social control. So I think that, it's a rapidly changing situation, and I certainly don't have any idea where it's all going.
I think another dimension of it, too, is that people are becoming, as our public and private selves blend and become in many ways indistinguishable, that the idea of a normal front that we're presenting the world that's consciously different from our strange little private lives is breaking down. And so all these people, especially younger people who, grew up in their kind of wild or, mildly wild in their teens and 20s, and they post lots of crazy pictures of absurd parties and goofy goings-on, and then suddenly they're in the job market and they have this sort of virtual trail. And so I sometimes think that more and more people are having to just accept that if you look closely enough at anybody's biographical record online, you're going to find quote-unquote embarrassing material, but of course the person doing the looking probably has that kind of stuff too. So that there really is a shift now, not just because of the changing sort of nature of technology, but the changing relationship of public and private. That we're actually.
Well, but Erik, I think another thing that happens, and certainly like a level of a measure of what's normal, especially in sexuality, is you can look at like the porn industry. And I think another thing that happens conversely to what you said is that people can have these private lives on the internet that will feed their like abnormal fetishes and stuff like that might not leave a visible trail, so they can present themselves as normal and then on the internet be involved in this totally crazy like side life. Instead of like having to go into like the red light district, they can just enter into the internet on their computer, and you can see by the pornography that's available on the internet all the strange kinks that people do have, that they're indulging in that kind of secret internet life.
Yeah, that was some of the most fun I had in the book, was trying to find a list of all the known kinks known to man, and of course it's probably impossible, but I have like 5 pages, a 5-page long list, So
it is actually one of the jewels of the book. I mean, it's almost like a poem, and there's a few that just blew my mind. There's the forniphilia, which is the sexual objectification in which a person's body is incorporated into a piece of furniture, and then there's one for all the eco-warriors out there, dendrophilia, sexual attraction to trees and other large plants.
I know, I think I'm guilty of that. Yeah, I think that you both raise really interesting questions. I think that it's very complicated because there are historical parallels. For instance, in the 60s, many of us who, got wild with drugs and, and rock and roll, then years later, when the culture changes, a lot of people suddenly who are in the job market hide their drug use, and they hide it from their own children, as a matter of fact. So perhaps some of these young people, if the climate changes, will really regret a lot of the stuff they put online, or it could go the other way, where everyone did it so much that it'll become totally accepted. It's very hard to know because culture shifts, and we get periods of reaction, periods of, I think the human being, we have strong tendencies towards wanting safety and security, and we have strong tendencies towards wanting novelty. So it's a constant battle within us as individuals and within our culture. The conservative and radical impulses live within all of us, and you never know which direction the culture is going to go in because the winds of history will blow in different directions. So it's very hard to know what change will be permanent and what change will be clamped down on and will have to take a new form in the future. It's very hard to know.
Well, here's a question about that sort of running off of what Maja mentioned earlier. Do you feel like, especially when you were looking at the sexual material, that the availability of, you talked about the sort of positive feedback nature of the Internet in terms of being able to burrow into your own little rabbit hole, that the availability of material actually intensifies the degree to which people will explore maybe inclinations or kinks that they have sort of in seed form, but then in another social context, yes, they might have it inside them, so they're a little bit off, a little bit quote-unquote unnormal that way or abnormal, but that in our current environment that people can actually just rage, and so that we're actually multiplying and intensifying kinks or perversions or whatever you want to call them, and or is it just always been that way, and this is just a new way for it to manifest?
Well, the debate, has gone on for a long time, with comic books first in the 30s and 40s, and then with, violence in film. I mean, it's so kind of funny, people putting down violence in rap music, and then it was rock and roll, and, did you ever listen to bluegrass songs? I mean, they're some of the most bloodthirsty Knoxville Girl, my God, these sort of psychotic killers humming along on the banjo, it's like, these debates have been going on a long, long time. I personally, I'm more of a libertarian, and I'm, I think let 1,000 flowers bloom in all ways as long as they're not harmful to anyone. And I think kinks are sort of a marvelously, the ones that are not truly dangerous and awful, and there's some, that involve violence and things like that. But basically, they're sort of another thing that makes us human. We're extremely culturally extravagant creatures who seem to create all kinds of weird music and architecture, and I think sexual kinks just seem to be another aspect of that. I wonder, though, I mean, my own question is, are some of these sexual kinks always the same as they've ever been, but they take new forms? Or as a society gets more technologically complex, does it actually create new kinks? You know, for instance, sort of sexual fantasies about robots and androids. Is this just something that's always been around? I guess we had E.T.A. Hoffman and giant dolls, you know, in the 19th century. So I don't know. You know, there are a lot of fascinating questions about this, but certainly it's true that Internet porn can be addictive. There's no question about that. But so can making money on Wall Street, and you know, so can fighting in war. There are a lot of things that can become addictive. So I don't know. I don't take a moral stand on any of it, but there's certainly interesting questions.
When it came to the question of the range of unusual beliefs that Americans hold, what were you surprised to discover? I mean, you probably were not surprised to discover facts about Christianity or the rapture, and because we're kind of used to that. But what in that field seemed interesting to you?
Well, the things that, you know, some of the things that surprised me was how old the narrative about the New World, you know, the New World Order and the sort of right-wing paranoias, how little that has changed in almost a century. You know, that you get writing sort of right-wing rantings, even from the 20s, that are almost verbatim some of the same stuff you see now, with slight twists. So that was interesting. And how many hundreds of books had been written on this stuff. So that was interesting. And then also how little the narrative about, you know, the Christian apocalypticism, how really constant that has been also as a sub-theme in our culture for a few centuries. But then the other thing was the stuff on the sort of progressive side, on the left or the counterculture, you know, the 2012 obsession, how big that's become, and then also some of the sort of techno-utopian, extropian, you know, Ray Kurzweil, the sort of obsession with the singularity. Some of these movements are much bigger. Also the paranoia about the government having planned the, you know, 9/11. And what was interesting to me is when I sort of tried to look at the best figures I could find and added it all up, all the people into all those beliefs and all the people into, you know, strong believers in UFOs, you know, I felt like an overwhelming majority of the population has one or another of these strange ideas. I mean, strange, they're not strange to them, and I'm not making judgments about it, but I'm just saying strange to a New York Times sort of mainstream view of the world. And that really kind of, in a way, spooked me. Although some people have told me that they found it reassuring that there's no normal mainstream out there. But I was a little bit spooked because it's a bit like, oh my God, we all have these strange beliefs, but there are no doctors or nurses left in the asylum. And even if I'm crazy, I'm scared of the other people who are crazy in a different way than I am. And so there was a little bit of me that kind of yearned for a kind of sane mainstream view, even if I disagree with large aspects of it, as sort of the rock that could hold the center. You know, some secular rationalists who could just keep it all together. Even if you look at, like,
Christianity, within Christianity, like, they'll think the Catholics are insane and weird, and, like, the Protestants, like, and even within that, like, normality, there's not a cohesive agreement on some kind of stable underlying thing that people could cling to, like you're saying, that would give, you know, some kind of respite from this variety.
What there is an agreement to not go too deep and not talk about religious stuff in public. That's find an almost taboo in America. And that's one reason that some of the weirdest fundamentalist stuff doesn't get really touched upon. You remember during the campaign when John McCain was seeking the support of this guy, John Hagee, who was this sort of, you know, extreme right-wing pastor, one of these people who believes in, you know, the end times and being an ally of Israel because the Battle of Megiddo has to happen, you know, that whole movement. But the media, the mainstream media, don't like to probe too deeply because what happens is that if you poke on it, it sort of reveals all these very large fault lines in American society with very sizable groups of people that you're going to anger, whether you say things one way or the other. So that's kind of interesting. There are taboos that the media really shy away from unless they're really forced to deal with something.
I found out my reaction to the book was interesting in that way too, in that the part that I found the most disturbing was the chapter about beliefs, even though I love, peculiar belief systems, and I always am drawn to unusual ideas and conspiracies. I think they're fascinating. But there's something about the way that you framed it, where the idea that all these people walking down the street, especially people who seem very normal, who are politically involved in sustaining, the institutions that I rely on, the idea that they, had kinky sex life, or that they, snorted cocaine, that doesn't bother me. But somehow the idea that distributed through them were all of these peculiar, ideas of, whatever, aliens running the UN, or that there's a mass conspiracy to, control, money flows, from some Masonic conspiracy, that the idea that, people can really be engaging with you in a normal, everyday way, and then, you take it down one step, and there could be these assumptions about reality that veer in multiple directions at once, is a kind of it's a bit vertiginous.
It is. Absolutely.
And one thing I wanted to say just about the New World Order idea, about why it's so consistent. I think one of the reasons that that particular cluster of ideas is so kind of consistent, and it certainly goes broader than America in this case, but it really has to do with a reflection of the reality of globalization. That there's something in even though globalization has existed to some degree for centuries in terms of world trade, and the construction of the corporation is intimately involved with establishing transnational flows of capital and goods, that as it gets more and more intensely established, that there's something fundamentally kind of unnerving about it to the parts of ourselves that are localized or identify with a people or a nation, and that beyond that point it becomes more difficult to identify, and there's sort of a fear reaction. So it's very much a shadow of something that is one of the most fundamental facts about our modern civilization.
Yeah, I would think that that's, to me, really in many domains, and when I've also written about ecology and politics, the trying to come to grips with modernity is really the fundamental question of our age, because human beings have limits. Our nervous systems have limits. Our digestive systems have limits. The Earth has a carrying capacity. Ecosystems have limits. But our economic system and our electronic communications are based on the idea of limitlessness and a constant expansion and speeding up of everything. And I think that there's a collision between the part of us that's normally, or that wants to cling to some kind of stability, whether it's familial or cultural or traditions, that's to some extent healthy to some degree. And when that's completely undermined by extremely rapid change and by dislocation, massive dislocation, I think we're wrestling with that, and a lot of the greatest literature and music and reflects that. I love the Allen Ginsberg, the section, his Moloch section of Howl, that talks about these monstrous buildings, and the idea that the horrors of modernity, which you see in William Blake also. That's something that I think we're wrestling with, and you get reactions on the right and the left and all around in different ways, and it's the fundamental question of the age. How can we cope with our technologies and with the speed of change, and not get completely deracinated and irrational?
Well, it seems like that ties in, too, to the limits of our physical body versus the limits of our consciousness. And it's almost like we're seeing this in parallel to that, with us coming to terms with how limitless consciousness is, and that idea of the abyss and things like that, and then what our physical bodies can actually take and what can manifest in the material world.
I just want to interrupt to say that we're listening to Expanding Mind, the Culture of Consciousness, with myself, the host, Erik Davis, and you can call in at 888-873-4643 or email mind@techgnosis, techgnosis.com. JP, I also wanted to get in a little bit here about the spiritual scene. You've been part of and observing and bringing that same sort of sociological fascination to American spirituality and particularly the sort of alternative strains for a while. I'm curious if you could take the temperature of it a little bit for me now. How do things seem to be changing compared to the 70s and 80s when you first saw this really huge kind of interest in alternative spirituality and New Age stuff?
That's an interesting question. In a way, I don't know. This is a period that's not overtly marked by any trend that I can notice that's radically striking in the same way that, in the 70s you saw this sudden influx of other cultures with the opening of China, and then in the 60s the Beatles had gone to India, and there was this explosion of interest in Indian esotericism and in yoga and so on. And yoga sort of came and went. There were several waves, a bit like heroin chic. There was yoga chic would come and go. And then suddenly about 15 years ago, yoga got completely established, and that's kind of one of the most fascinating penetrations culturally, where it really broke through and has become a norm. I always thought that if New York City had its own currency, the one side of the bill would be a young woman carrying a yoga mat holding a chai latte in one hand and a yoga mat in the other. It would be emblematic of modern urban life.
I see that every day in LA.
What's that?
I see that every day in LA.
Exactly, everywhere. Yeah.
Well, what do you think that indicates? I mean, that seems utterly fascinating to me too, and it seems like there's two sides to it. One is that if yoga is a practice that actually engages the transformative potentials of the body and the energy body in particular to kind of inculcate changes in consciousness and really begin a sort of alchemical process, then it's like kind of an extraordinary thing that all this is happening. It's like people are almost preparing themselves for some kind of larger change or some kind of opening of the possibilities of consciousness. And at the same time, I can look at it and see it as completely as just the ideal form of commodified spirituality for a kind of youth-obsessed, overly can-do, anxious culture that loves to have to buy, even something that's essentially free and requires no investment, like yoga, becomes this multi-million-dollar industry of clothes and the right mat and the workshops and the teachers who are great. And it's almost like both things seem to be happening, but it's not clear to me why it's happening.
Well, I think that both are true, and you get certain similar things with gurus in India. It's not just America. I think because definitely it's more exaggerated here because our society is so, big and dynamic and rich. But I think that goes to something deeper, which is, as I look at the counterculture, in its modern form, starting in the 60s and even before, going all the way to now, I see that our culture is pulling in two different directions. On the one hand, people really yearn for a return to something earthy, to local foods, to organic foods, to getting food from their CSA, and for living with solar panels in the country, and being more in touch and doing yoga and eating healthier and so on. And then we're into our iPods and dream of space stations and living forever, as the Extropians do, and that one day we'll have machines embedded behind our eyelids. Even Terence McKenna used to fantasize about tiny computers that would permit us to live like naked prelapsarian apes, except with super technology embedded under our skin. So you find these sort of two different pulls, one towards this sort of hyper-technological utopian idea, and the other one's a sort of reverse utopian idea of a return to simplicity and to more, earth-friendly ideas. And the weird thing is that these things coexist within each of us. Many of us in the counterculture, to use that term, have both these tendencies in us at the same time.
I think
that's what's interesting to me.
It partly reflects what Maja was talking about, that in a way, as human beings, we have bodies, or we are bodies, and our bodies are limited in many ways, or they're constrained, or at least they have very distinct boundaries, and they live in a material world that also has limits and boundaries, and yet there's something in consciousness that seems to expand, that seems to at least be drawn to the dream of kind of endless expansion. Earlier, Maja had raised the question about the connection between our ideas of the normal and the ideas of the natural. I'm curious, like particularly because you've looked a lot at ecology and ecological metaphors, and ecological ideas can go very. It can be very interesting. It can be very scary when you try to apply them to human society and human psychology. I'm curious, how do you feel that there are norms available inside of nature or inside biology in terms of human beings and human psychology?
Well, let me say this. I think that it is very tricky domain, because when you start to get, some of my ecologist friends, very close friends, really get into using metaphors of nature, and even I have been known to do it, and, that nature is all symbiosis and cooperation. Yeah, there's a lot of that, and there's also a lot of nature is red in tooth and claw. Both are true. And so one has to be, not gaga about these things. On the other hand, I do think that we are... our consciousness is a fascinating, and I don't know if it's limitless, but it's certainly not as limited as we usually think it is. But we are anchored in the body, and we are anchored in ecosystems. And I think that it's important to honor that and to try to create a life and a society that is living in far more harmony, or certainly in a less destructive relationship with that environment, with our own bodies, and to get to the point about about consciousness. It's interesting that those cultures, whether they're Indian culture or Buddhism or Taoism, these cultures that really developed these extremely sophisticated approaches to consciousness, often had a lot of quiet time and tranquility. And one of the issues, I think, that there's a contradiction between trying to develop your consciousness and the sheer noise and speed of modernity. So this is something that, that's going to... There's a kind of collision there, I think, between the ideas of limitlessness in the material sense and simplifying your life so that you can cultivate the limitlessness of consciousness. There's a contradiction there, I think. And then one more thing about nature is, I think, it's tricky because what's natural is used by different groups to sort of push what they want. For instance, a lot of Christians say, homosexuality is not natural. Well, it's existed for a long time. It exists in many animal species, so it seems perfectly natural in that sense as a minority phenomenon in our species and in other species. And on the other hand, there are a lot of things that are natural that we discourage. You're certainly not encouraged to go bite your rivals and urinate on them, as our chimpanzee might do. So these are tricky areas, you know what I mean? It's very easy to invoke nature to push your point of view. But I do firmly believe that it's important to honor the physical world, ecosystems, and our bodies, to develop a sane relationship with them, because it's very hard to explore consciousness if you don't take care of the physical world and your body first.
Absolutely. Well, we're getting near the end, and I didn't want to let the time drip away without mentioning what, in some ways, was the most fascinating chapter for me, or at least the most eye-opening, was the chapter of your book, Delusions of Normality, on money and just the pervasiveness of corruption. And here, this seemed particularly interesting to me because it focused even more than the other topics in the book how, even though we know, and if we're reading the newspaper, if we're paying attention, even though we know that corruption is pervasive, that we still sustain this fiction of all of these people doing the right thing, doing the good thing, that's basically the norm, and that the corruption is a sort of deviation and an anomaly. And that you really challenge that. You really go, that really just might not be what's going on.
Right. No, I think that, of course, I feel my view is confirmed every day. I mean, just when I pick up the newspaper, I saw last week there was this massive corruption bust in New Jersey with 3 mayors and 5 rabbis, and, that included trafficking in kidneys. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. And so every day I see confirmation of my thesis. I think that it's very hard for people to fully grasp it because, in a way, we're very atomized in our culture. So you live in your particular world, and even if you know that in your world things are very corrupt, you probably assume, you just sort of accept that maybe it's not that way in other domains of life. And even people are fairly cynical and say, it's all corrupt and the rich are all screwing us, blah, blah, blah. Even they have to assume when you go out in the street that, things will be taken care of, the trains are running and, things seem to work to some degree, That's the thing. So as long as things seem to be functioning, there's sort of this fundamental idea that basically things are being taken care of, so it can't be that bad. But the point is that money, by its very nature, is a corrosive force. And I'm not saying we can do without it. I mean, we live in a highly complex society. I don't see how we can do without money. But we have to understand that it's like asking children to handle plutonium carefully, to expect that a border guard who gets paid a pittance is going to be able to watch while tons of cocaine or grass or, suitcases full of money pass through and not take payoffs. Or that a woman who's desperate to feed her children won't turn to prostitution if she can't do anything else. This idea that, if money exists and poverty exists and greed exists, and these have always existed in human beings, then we're going to have corruption. And it's going to be on a fairly massive scale the more complex the financial system is and the faster the flows of money around the world are. And so I think that if one really examines things like the offshore banking system in detail, one realizes that the elites in the world don't want to destabilize that system. They want a very large covert system because it suits many of their purposes. And even though occasionally organized crime people or terrorists use these covert ways of moving money, it's much more used by rich people and corporations who want to shield their incomes, and even by government intelligence operations. So I think that if you really look at the way money works, you begin to realize that corruption is not an exception. It's one of the foundational pillars of how the society works.
Well, it's true, and I don't know if you ever read that book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of
Right,
Crowds.
sure. No, I cite it, in fact, yeah.
Yeah, he mentions that's like the very invention of money was under those circumstances. Like it goes back to its inception, and it's unavoidable.
Right. But I think that if we realize that, then we would try to fashion systems that were realistic and that were much more transparent. You would still have corruption, but I think that for instance, it's shocking to me, given the financial collapse, how timid the reforms that people are talking about are. It's almost as though suddenly everyone's forgotten what's happened and the bankers are back in business, and they don't want to, quote unquote, stifle the creativity of the financial markets.
Well, here's a question for you on that. Now, we can partly talk about that factor or that fact as being the result of people in power wanting to keep things fairly continuous with the previous regime. But there's definitely also a psychological factor among ordinary people that it's really difficult to really take on and sort of live with the degree of change that I think a lot of people would say needs to at least be attempted. What is it that, like, given the like everybody has this stuff in their face, and anybody who looks at it to any degree, right or left, will see these enormous problems and imbalances with how things have come about, unless you're some of the super rich who have who live in your own kind of bubble. And yet we are like, well, I guess things are just going to go where they are. Where does that come from? Is it fatalism? Is it a fear of having to recognize just how much things can change, that we want things to be sort of continuous and sustained in some way? What is that block about?
Well, I think for one thing, our society is so complex that many of these issues are extremely difficult to wrap one's brain around. We're seeing that with the health care reform. It's almost mind-numbing, the complexity of it. And the average person, has to feed their family and survive and get through the day and fight with their own demons. And it's not that easy. And also there's a sense of powerlessness, because when you get a mass society, for most of our evolutionary trajectory, we lived in small bands. And I think there's something where you get very large agglomerations of people, and there's a disempowerment that occurs. And everything around us, our architecture, the scope of our society, makes us feel powerless, and to some extent it's true, we are. And even people in positions of power feel the limits of that, so that you get a situation where no one feels in control completely. Or even partially. So I think that it's very difficult, and those who would really attempt change find that there are always unforeseen consequences. Those of us who were revolutionaries, when a revolution happens, suddenly all these things can happen. Sometimes you can wind up with a worse situation than what you overthrew. So it's not an easy situation to deal with.
Definitely not, but I really encourage people to check out Delusions of Normality by J.P. Harpignies. You've been listening to Expanding Mind. And you can email me or contact me through my website, www.techgnosis.com. And I just wanted to announce that I'll be doing a teleseminar starting today, kind of on some of these topics on forging community through visionary art. And if you're interested in finding out more, we'll be talking to Burning Man founder Larry Harvey, visionary artist Alex Gray, and others. And you can check that out at evolverintensives.com, visionary art. So check that out. I wanted to thank our guest JP again, and Maja. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun.
All right. So next week we'll be talking to Dennis McKenna, the ethnobotanist, an expert in the pharmacology and culture of ayahuasca groups, and the brother of the renegade mushroom bard Terrence McKenna. So tune in there to Expanding Mind, and see you on the flip side.